Let's look at the impact and implications of Constantine's conversion for the Church. We'll begin by looking at the positive implications. First, increased patronage. Let's provide some background here. Christianity began as a despised religion in a land led by a dictator, and thus Christianity rarely had any funds at its disposal to spread the message. Bishops, especially rural ones, often had other jobs. The church met mostly inside homes. There were no great structures, and the few structures that emerged in the 3rd century were very simple, with little ornamentation. Well, all that changes with Constantine. When he converts, he puts the resources of the Roman Empire behind Christianity. And I'm not going to suggest how he saw his role right away, but here is mosaic from Constantine's era. And Constantine sees himself as the figure on the left. And what is he giving Jesus? A big sack of money. And so Constantine saw himself as funding the growth of Christianity through his federal funds. And so bishops now essentially had federal funding to engage in their godly mission. And we see that in our reading today. For the first time, bishops had all the resources they want. They could build churches, they could publish books, they could give to the poor. In fact, Constantine engages in one of the greatest empire-wide building projects since Alexander the Great, building churches and public buildings everywhere. In fact, he built 7 major churches in Rome alone, and he coated them with gold mosaics, filled them with silver candelabras. So the churches became the places where people wanted to go and hear, while the pagan temples across the street or around the corner, well, those were all old and being blown away with these new modern buildings. So also Constantine encourages and provides imperial underwriting for pilgrimages to Jerusalem. And so he rebuilt Jerusalem just like a righteous king would do, and he really encouraged people going there to deepen their faith and line the pocketbooks of the people who lived there. So Constantine places the financial resources of the empire behind Christianity. He said, whatever funds you need to be competitive, I'm here to supply them. That's the first thing. Second, Constantine led people to become Christians. That is, he is evangelical. He spread the good news. So before Constantine, maybe 1 in 10 or 1 in 20 people were Christians, but they weren't evenly spaced throughout the empire. They tended to be more in the eastern part of the Roman Empire and northern Africa. They tended to be in some towns and not in others. After Constantine's conversion, the message of Christianity was literally spread throughout the Roman Empire by the resources he provided. And it was like as if all the mass media of the state was now supporting the dissemination of the Christian message. Constantine made Sunday a public holiday. So while you didn't have to go to church, you also didn't have to work. And you knew Constantine was in church, might be a good idea for going. He required his soldiers to pray on Sunday. Now, he didn't force them to pray to Jesus, but if you were a general wanting to get on Constantine's good side, you probably did. Crosses were now in military uniforms, state buildings, and coins. And he used the official outlets of the church to encourage people to receive baptism. So there's essentially a state-funded propaganda campaign to get people to become Christians under Constantine. And he was highly successful. The number of Christians probably rose about 20 to 30 million during his reign, almost 1 million new Christians a year. In fact, at one point, he calls himself the 13th apostle. Now that sounds really like arrogant and so forth. But to be fair, he could say, look, when I stand before God, the 12 apostles combined created, 10,000 Christians? I've got 20, 30 million under my belt. And so, he's got a case. And if you were to make it as a proportion to America, that would be like somebody becoming president and then 200 million Americans choosing his or her religion. He had a case to say he was the greatest evangelist ever. So the message about Jesus was out by every possible means available, and it was successful. People were responding in droves. The third positive implication was that Constantine sought to unify and define Christianity. So remember, for Constantine, one of the benefits of becoming Christian was that the empire now could shift their allegiance from a really decentralized pagan traditions to a centralized Christian tradition, and he wanted it unified. And in fact, he was really surprised that when he converted, he discovered that Christians were really divided largely upon doctrinal lines, but also ethnic and other reasons behind it too. Now, this should become no surprise to us. Remember, the very first Christian writing we have is First Thessalonians, which is about a fight within the church. And so Christians have always been arguing with each other. But what's different about Constantine is that Constantine really pushed the church to be unified in their message and clear on what we all believed as Christians at the time. And so unity was based on a shared faith and a common doctrine. And so Constantine had an idea. He said, okay, if people are fighting, let's get all the bishops together in one room. And so he did this in a place called Nicaea in 325. And at one side of the table, he put the Gospels, since the church will always be grounded in the Gospels. On the other side of the room, he sat. And in between the Gospels and him were all these bishops. And he said, figure out the faith. Find something that you all could unify around. And this is the origins of the Nicene Creed, which was created in 325 in Nicaea at the prompting of Constantine to try to put together a unified basis for Christianity. The Nicene Creed is still used today, especially in Orthodox and Catholic circles, but it goes back to Constantine and his desire to unify the church. So those are three positive implications. He increased patronage to the church, and so the church could grow in physical structures and the work they did. He was evangelistic, so many people became Christians during Constantine's time. And third, he unified Christians around doctrine. So you might say Constantine did so many good things for the church, but there are also some negative implications, and let's look at those. First, politics and religion became fused. Let's provide some background here. Constantine had long been, or Christians had long been suspicious of the government and the powers that be. It's not that they liked persecution, but they thought that if you were concerned with the power structures of this world, your focus wouldn't be on your eternal life. Jesus made it clear, my kingdom is not of this world. When he didn't speak much about government, his only real direct line about government was give to Caesar unto Caesar, that is, pay your taxes. And as Christians await the second coming, there was this focus that said, look, this world won't be here long, so why spend your time trying to, arrange the deck chairs, the Titanic, when Jesus comes back, it's all going down. This all changes with Constantine. So instead of not caring about government and worldly things, Constantine now sets himself up as a Christian king. And he has this notion that the earthly kingdom and the heavenly kingdom are mirrors of each other. So that while Constantine rules the earthly kingdom for God, Jesus rules the heavenly kingdom for God. And in fact, in the throne room, he actually had a throne for Jesus and a throne for himself. And it became that Constantine came to see himself as the representative of God on earth in government. He was the all-ruling one. Now, this led to many abuses. Constantine used Christianity to further his political means. He was not above using the financial control over the bishops to have things, to do things for the state that they probably wouldn't like to do. I discovered one area in reading through a text where Constantine makes the Bishop of Alexandria inspect the brothels for cleanliness, something that bishops probably weren't likely to do otherwise. Furthermore, he often used his Christianity to ground some pretty horrific behaviors. So, for example, he strangles one of his rivals, or he has his rival strangled, and then he stands on the body and says, "Does not this in every way prove the providence of God and his loving care for the interests of man?" So now, political dissent was regarded as a sin against God. Political rivals could be exiled for the good of their soul. And so the mixing of power, politics, and religion was ultimately corrupting. It didn't take long to go from being the persecuted as Christians to the persecutor. So persecution ends in 313. Christianity gains emperor support with Constantine. Constantine's son, by 356, closes all Roman temples, closes all what we would call now the pagan temples, and prohibits sacrificing to gods on pains of death. By 381, Christianity is the official religion of the empire, and by 391, practicing any Greek or traditional religion is punishable by death. So notice how Christians went from persecuted to persecutor really, really quickly. Seems like once you have power, power tends to corrupt. And who was at the negative end of that persecution? Well, first, pagans or adherents to traditional Greek and Roman religions. Jews in particular were labeled as Christ killers, and they were signaled out for persecution. But also all those various forms of Christianity that had arisen in the first 4 centuries and had an isolated following. So the Marcionites, the Valentinians, the Encratites, the Gnostics, the Montanists, the Novatianists, all of these groups were heavily persecuted by Constantine and his successors in order to try to unify Christianity. Now, by what logic did they justify this persecution? Because how could killing people be seen as Christian? Well, think of it this way. Let's say we have a figure in our town named John, and John is teaching a false form of Christianity. Let's say he's saying that Jesus is a magic mushroom and that Christians should consume him ritually every day. Well, undoubtedly, John is going to hell. There's no question about that. But God is a just God, and his penalty in hell will be commensurate with the amount of harm he does. So, if we allow John to continue to preach, well, think of how many people he'll lead astray over time. And then think of the penalty he will receive in hell for leading more and more people astray. Isn't it the most loving thing that you could possibly do to kill John now and thus lessen the amount of penalty and the severity of the penalty that he receives in hell? And so when persecution happened, it was primarily about showing love and compassion for somebody, because what you're doing is relieving them of future penalties and torture in hell. And so politics and religion became fused. Persecution upon different people became normal. Second of all, as we said, for the first few hundred years, there was no worldly reason to be Christian. In other words, you didn't gain a lot, right? If anything, you might be persecuted for being a Christian. Afterwards, though, after Constantine, it became trendy to be Christian. That is, newest buildings were all Christian. There was dazzling priest vestments, and you had certain value of being the same religion as the empire. In fact, we have a whole discussion recorded in Gaza of city members saying that, hey, if we all convert to Christianity, Constantine will fund our new buildings. And so there was very little sacrifice required to be a Christian. You weren't going to be ostracized. No one's going to think you were weird. You weren't going to be double taxed. The result was an influx of really questionable Christians along those lines. Lastly, the church became more and more pagan in norms. That is, a lot of people, these new converts, like some of the old things. So let's just take pagan holidays and make them Christian. Let's add incense to the service. Let's make the services more and more like the pagan services. And so in some ways, there were numerous negative accommodations to pagan norms. So political and religion was fused, leading to persecution, questionable converts, and accommodations to pay.